Oh, so before I begin the actual video, I wanted to add this little tag on because I got a lot of responses to the free books that I didn't expect I was going to get. So I'm just going to do a drawing, and I'll contact anyone privately who got who commented and said they wanted one of the books, and we'll arrange to send it out. That may take me a while, but I just wanted to get that out there before I forgot. So on to the juice. See you in a sec. Morning, folks. Saturday morning. So I literally just got a question on one of my videos, and I thought it was worth a response. Actually, that was part of a larger conversation, which was about it was a request. It was a response to. All right, I just kind of woke up. Um, my video on the bonfire walkthrough, and the question was whether or not I would. So in that video, I talked about how I experienced some frustration with decks that were all sort of white and straight. Um, and the question was whether I had quibbles with decks that only, the question was, would you have the same quibbles if the deck had only black and gay folks or black gay folks? Um, and just in terms of how the folks in the deck are all straight, unless it's sort of an erotic deck, where they're engaged in a sex act of some kind. I'm paraphrasing. So the question I thought was an interesting one, and part of a discussion I think that's worth having. And as I always say in my videos, I can only speak from my own preferences and experience. Uh, but so to address the first question, which is how I feel about decks that might be all one thing, not just necessarily a deck that was all black gay people or black and gay folks or whatever the thing is. I don't have any problem with decks that are specific to a community. There are decks that have themes in that way, and there are decks that represent Black life. There are decks that represent Asian, experience. There are decks that represent all kinds of them. Um, there was even a gay deck, which I don't have any problem with. I think it's out of print, but I think recently Norse Pagan Witch did a video sort of walkthrough of it, and it was it wasn't a deck that spoke to me, and I can talk about why in a bit. So I mean I don't have any problem with decks that are all one thing. Um, I and I think that there should be decks that are specific to communities because there should be decks that speak to everyone. Um, and as I'm saying this, I think it's important for me to recognize that these are the opinions of like a white guy, you know. But when it comes to decks that represent a community specifically, my feeling is that they should ideally be created by people with experience in that community. I would not think it would be great for me to go create a deck that represents the lives of Latino women. um Even if I live in a community that's almost exclusively Latino women, that's not an experience that I have. you know, so that would be me appropriating that experience. Um, Even if my intentions were good, that still would be appropriation, right? Um, if I knew an artist who was a Latino woman who was reading tarot and said, "Oh, I wish there was a deck," and I said, "You should make one." You know what I mean? Like, why you're an artist? Why don't you make one? Oh, and she said, "Well, I don't know enough about it." Then in that way, I could encourage and be a good champion. Um, but I wouldn't say, "Boy, that really is a gap in the market," and I'm gonna do that. That to me would be bad, even if my intentions were good. So my feeling about decks that represent a community is that ideally they would be created by someone within that community, right? So that it represents the experience of that community as accurately as possible, knowing, of course, that every artist is filtering their work through their own lens and their own life experience. And so, even saying, a deck created by a Latino woman artist, a cisgendered woman Latino artist, or Latina, I should say. It's very hard to talk about this stuff, right? Because we don't have language that addresses this really well, um, and we don't. And the language we do have is so affected by years of unfortunate treatment and behavior, and so again, as I discuss this stuff, please know that I'm coming at it from a place of as inclusive as I have the experience and language to be. um so appropriative decks would not be good to me. And you don't see a whole lot of that in tarot these days, I don't think. Um, but there has been in the past. There have been decks that sort of purport to be Asian influenced that are by white artists. A lot of the history of the world is wrapped up in that, and there's an offensive connotation in there. It's not just appropriation, but um, what has come to be called Orientalism, which is a difficult phrase even because of its connotations. Um, in it becomes sort of a fetishizing of the exotic, which is something that um, Caucasian people have done to Eastern cultures, um, and these are very complicated topics. So I'm not going to venture too far down that rabbit hole. But I do believe there are conversations that should be had. There's conversations I've heard in the world of yoga about whether yoga is an appropriation of a spiritual belief into an American exercise fad. I don't have an opinion on that one way or another, but there's discussion about that. And they're discussions that I feel like we should engage in. So that's my roundabout way of saying how I feel about decks that are all one thing. Um, I think that they're great if they truly represent and come out of the experience of whatever that one thing is, whatever that group is. Um, I think that's what I have to say about that. Um, so I don't have quibbles with decks as long as that with themed decks in that way, as long as they're not appropriative. Um, as long as it's not someone coming in and using someone else's life or culture, um, regardless of whether the intent is good or bad, as a way to make money, or even not make money, but as a way to capture an experience that isn't theirs. Um, of course, you could argue part of what we do is tarot is try to capture experiences that aren't ours, but this is a different thing. It's something, by the way, that's not just a conversation that I've been having in this world. It's a conversation that happens a lot in the theater world right now, which is who gets to tell whose stories. um, I have a play right now that's doing fairly well, but I've also gotten some questions about it because it's about a lesbian couple. Actually, it's about a couple. And one of the things about the play is that to me, it's not about a lesbian couple. It's a couple um, who happen to be lesbians. And I'm going to get into the gay thing in a little bit. But I've gotten a lot of questions about who are you as a man, a cisgendered a cisgendered man, to write a play about lesbians. Um, and I don't have a good answer to that, other than that. I could have made it a straight couple. I could have made it a gay male couple. But I recognize that there is an inequity in theater, not just in writing voices, but in good roles for women. So I feel like as a white male taking up space, um, in the community of theater artists, one thing that I have a responsibility to do is, I can't be a cisgendered woman, or any other race. Like, I just can't be. But what I can do is try to expand the pool of roles for women, for example. Um, and by working with enough um, artists who can tell me if I'm getting it wrong. Um, I would rather have to defend the choice of expanding the pool of roles for women, say, than answer to being another writer taking up space who's creating more roles for men when they're already. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a difficult thing to balance. Um, but I'll accept the criticism that maybe I don't have the experience of a lesbian couple. Um, I'll accept that more than I'll accept just creating more roles for white guy. You know what I mean? Like, there's no perfect answer to these things, but we try. And I think we also try to come at things from places of empathy. And I think it's important that the conversation keeps happening, because I don't know that there are right or wrong answers. So anyway, so the reason that this is on my mind and why the question prompted a video is because it's something that, it's not a conversation that's just happening here. It's a conversation that I've been engaged in, or trying to remain engaged in, everywhere. Because the bottom line is, I benefit from white male privilege. I have been affected by it negatively, straight privilege. And I'm going to talk about that shortly, as I keep saying. And from my own experience, I think the white male privilege has outweighed the negative impacts of being affected by other people's straight privilege, right? But um, when you're in the default majority, you need to be aware of the the and again, this is a scary thing for me to go down, because I get very passionate about this, but these are the opinions of a white guy, right? You know what I mean? So I'm trying to create dialogue, and view the world as openly as I can. Those of us who grew up with white privilege, because white in this country is the default, don't know, for example, firsthand, what it's like to turn on the television if you're a child of the 70s or 80s. I think maybe it's a little bit different now, but not much. We don't know what it's like to turn on TV and see television shows and advertisements that depict a whole other world that doesn't look like ours. We don't have that experience, and we never will. Um, and I feel like it's important for us to recognize things like that. So, again, these are tricky topics, right? But I'm trying to sort of explore where my opinions come from, and how I got that far. And I definitely was a person who would hear phrases like white male privilege and think, oh, fuck, you know what I mean? Like, another thing as a white guy that I've done wrong that I had no control of. And like, I'm not rich, I'm not, so I've early on in these dialogues sort of said, oh, well, where's my privilege? The thing is that the word privilege is deceptive, because it sounds like you're living a life of luxury, and that's not what it is. What it means, as far as I understand it, is that you're the default. Um, when people think of someone successful, for example, um, you are not the first thought people think of when they think of a criminal. Um, or you are unlikely to cause anxiety getting on an airplane. That's what privilege is. Um, what privilege is also not knowing what it's like to be the only one in a room. Um, and as a gay person, I can say one thing. I mentioned straight privilege, and again, this isn't an accusation. It's something that is part of your life. Is that you likely, as a heterosexual, may not know what it's like to be the only one in your family. Especially if you grew up in a religious family that has negative feelings towards gay folks. And that's an experience I have. I know what it's like to be the only one in my family. I know what it's like to um, see an article, in a newspaper that your father works on condemning who you are, you know. And that's why I've gotten a lot out of therapy, and PS, my relationship with my family is fine. Um, but this idea of privilege and default is important. Um, and that's why when I look at a tarot deck that features all white folks, it's another example of white privilege because there's no because once again whiteness becomes the default experience through which as a reader we are viewing other people's experiences. So if I'm reading for someone who isn't a straight white person and I'm reaching for a deck that features all white people, and I'll talk about this again, the gay thing in a minute. It sounds so weird to say it that way. I'm asking that person, and I'm not even asking that person because it doesn't occur to me, to once again look at their life through the lens of whiteness. So that's ultimately why when I read for other people, I'll use a really old deck that doesn't have a lot of people in it, or where the people look literally paper white, so that the people aren't colored in any way, another loaded word. Or I'll use decks with no people in them. Or I use the World Spirit deck, which, I really like and I think has some problems. I think that deck can be slightly stereotypical in some depictions. That's a real, but I think it comes from a generous place. So that's why I would love to see more decks that depict a diversity of experience and a diversity of tonalities and a diversity of life, so that we are not asking anyone to continue looking at whiteness as the default experience. And whether we like it or not, if we're using a pictorial deck in any way, and I think the only, there's a lot of argument about what is pictorial and what's not, but let's just sort of use that term broadly. Whenever we ask someone to look at cards that we're laying out for them, and we're using an entirely white deck, we're saying implicitly, please put aside your experience and allow me to interpret your experience through these white images. You know what I mean? And so, while I have no problem with theme decks, assuming they're not appropriative, what I would love as a reader is to be able to reach for a deck that doesn't ask anyone to put aside their experience and view it through a lens of white people. That's the ultimate thing. So I'm not necessarily looking for theme decks. I'm looking for decks that depict a range of experience. And though I feel that way, I'm still using, the deck that I use most for readings with other folks is the Wild Unknown, because there's no people in it, but I don't use it exclusively, and I am using decks like the Marseille and the Corte de Tarocchi, which are European and so white, and they just happen to not have a lot of people in them. The people in them are white, and when I'm doing that, I'm saying to someone I'm reading for, if that person is not white, please put aside your experience and view your experience now through these white images. And I think in many ways, like, that's, again, because it's the default, probably not a lot of people notice that, including probably people who are coming for readings and aren't necessarily white, you know what I mean? and that's an assumption, but I think because it is the default, it's also a European system. Um, so maybe the assumption or the assumption of folks coming in is that it's going to be, it's going to be all European looking people. Anyway, this is a very sticky topic, as you can see, hence my reticence to sort of say the wrong thing. And I really don't want to say the wrong thing. What I really want to say is the inclusive thing. The salient message, I guess, is what I want as a reader are more decks that allow me to not have to imply Caucasian experience and ask anyone to go to white as the default. In that same vein, heterosexuality is the default and has been for a lot of human history. And so part of the question I was asked was, how do I know a deck features all straight people unless they're engaged in sex? And that's an interesting question. And the way that I know it is because heterosexual relationships are the default. The way that I know it is that as a gay man, I know that gay relationships are not exclusively about sex acts. When I see a picture of the Two of Cups and I see a man and a woman looking at each other, I know that's a straight couple because straight couples are the default. When I look at the Emperor and the Empress as separate cards, I know that's a straight pairing because that's the default in life. If I see friends, if I see a man and a woman just as friends on a card, for example, if I'm looking at the Six of Cups, say, which frequently has a male and a female figure, I know that they're both straight because that is the default. So whether if the maybe the art, maybe Pamela Coleman Smith intended that one of the two figures in the Six of Cups was a gay person, but I doubt it. And so I don't, and this is not a criticism of anybody or anything. It's just that, as white in this country is and I'm speaking specifically of the United States, but there are many countries in the world where white is the default. So just as whiteness is the default, heterosexuality is the default. So I know that a card depicts heterosexual folks, regardless of what they're doing in it, because I know that in this world, still, that is the default relationship. When people picture a family, they picture a man and a woman and some kids. That's changing, but the default still is man, woman, kids. Cisgendered man, woman, kids. Modern Family, just in its name, like the TV show Modern Family tells us that, Cam and Mitch aren't the default because we're looking at modern families. We're not looking at families. The show's, unlike Friends, again, not a single gay character in the main cast of Friends, and the gay characters that were on Friends, were sort of the annoying lesbian couple that ruined Ross's life, right? And try to find a person who wasn't white on that show. Television is actually a really good example of default because that's where most of us learn cultural norms. And as a child, who grew up in the 80s and 90s, you'd be hard pressed to find a gay character that wasn't, the first gay character I remember seeing on TV was The Golden Girls, which is a show I still love. But the wedding planner, when Sophia was getting married, was the stereotypical mincing queen, who that's what I learned as a young child that a gay man was. And so, of course, you're going to be embarrassed or ashamed of that because no one wants to act that way. The guy's a sissy, and those were words people were calling me as a child. Now I'm just sharing my own experience so that I can tell you the lens through which I'm viewing the tarot, right? And television. So, up until Will and Grace, and even I had a lot of problems watching Will and Grace, for example, because I found like that was an excuse to tell gay jokes on TV in many instances. But the depictions of gay folks in mainstream was not the depiction of straight folks who were they were just normal. Whenever gay people were depicted in movies and TV, as I was in my formative years, they were special in some way. You know, in the Birdcage, they were sort of anxious drag artists. In, you know, the movie Jeffrey, they were, you know, the Pink Panthers. There was it dealt in stereotypes, um, and you become hyper aware of that, even though you do deal you know, and you do deal with straight stereotypes, you know, all the time. Any Judd Apatow, you know, again, I'm going down a sticky road, right? But Judd Apatow movies get a reputation for being kind of uh, feminist regressive, you know, because women in his movies tend to be harpies, you know, or simps. Um, but the men aren't depicted any better. You know, the men aren't geniuses. There are a lot of idiotic man boys. Um, but the conversation we're having now is that it's easier when people imagine a successful person, it's usually a white guy who's not a Judd Apatow character. We become hypersensitive to the harpies in depicted in movies, because it's harder to find more fully fleshed out women, you know, in mainstream American comedy. Um, in the same way that up until recently, it was hard to find, you know, fully fleshed, and even when there were gay shows on TV, they didn't depict life as a lot of us live it, you know. I mean, I remember hating the show Queer as Folk, or at least the HBO version of it, because it was just all sex all the time, and that wasn't the life that I lived. It's still not, you know. um that wasn't that wasn't my life, and you know, so there's more to my experience as a gay man than being a gay man, but when I am depicted as one, I want to be depicted more accurately than that. And sort of gay men who can't exist in the world as something other than sexual beings is another stereotype, um, which is something again that white privilege gives the world. It's not exceptional, you know. It's and again, this is where the dialogue becomes difficult, right? Because a straight viewer may watch this and say, well, here are a list of examples of what, you know, where straight white people are depicted badly. Well, of course, but again, it's harder to find fleshed out examples, or has been. It's getting better, but still, for those of us that grew up that way, the default is, you know, I still think of myself as an exception in many ways. You know, when I think about the idea of marrying my partner, you know, I have complicated feelings about marriage too. Not the idea of monogamy, but about marriage. Um, it becomes a gay wedding, not a wedding. You know what I mean? Um, Still in my mind, you know, and I have a bias against that. You know, where it feels exceptional in some way, and I don't want to be exceptional in that way. You know, so I want to know that when I look at a deck of cards, that the relationships are not by default heterosexual, either because they are modern, you know, they weren't made 100 years ago or more, um, or that the intent of the artist was such that I could put whatever I wanted in there, you know, which is again why I'm drawn to decks that don't have people in them, because I'm not, you know, I've talked about my attraction to decks with non-situational pip cards, uh, and how it was sort of a relief to experience them, because I found the pictures after a while kind of limiting and distracting. It's the same thing with looking at deck after deck, where the implication of from my life experience is that the relationships are heterosexual, because of course they are, you know, of course, because that's the default. You know, the default relationships depicted in tarot by and large are straight white people. And so what I'm looking for in more decks is more inclusivity. And when a deck has a couple token cards, that almost makes me more upset, because I feel like the creators recognize the need for more diversity, but aren't honest. And again, like it's not nefarious intent, you know, it's not meanness, it's conditioning. But we recognize, and we throw in a few tokens, but we've recognized that there needs to be more diversity. So why isn't there more of it? Why does it have to be one or two cards? You know, why can't it be more? And that's one reason why the World Spirit Tarot, I think, has been the best that I have seen so far. And I know there are decks in progress that have this. Um, I can't remember the name of the deck that's in progress, but I think Noel Arthurian is the Instagram account, who's creating a sort of Rider-Waite Smith inspired deck that features an array of gender states, relationships, diversity, um, disabilities and abilities. That features the world that we see when we open our front door and go to the mall. And it's you know what I mean, like the broad experience, so that we're not asking anyone to put their experience aside so that we can go back to our default straight white experience. That's why I feel the way that I feel. And my hope is for a more colorful, diverse um experience, you know. Um so these are very difficult topics to talk about well, because of the limits of language and because of the effect that language can have on us. The old sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That's false. That's something we tell kids so they don't feel bad about bullied. Well, kids should feel bad about being bullied, but the bullies should feel worse. You know what I mean? And that's because the default is, right? Let's talk about defaults. The default is that the bullied needs to deal with it and go to therapy. The default isn't that we deal with the bully. Again, that's changing, but it's still a reality. Words hurt because of the feelings they incite. Words are triggers. Um, and that could go down a whole other path of things like trigger warnings and what kinds of conversations we should be having. That's not within the scope of this conversation. Words trigger emotions. Um, and when I say white privilege or straight privilege, that's going to trigger emotion in everybody who hears it, who has heard it before. Um, for white people, it triggers defensiveness because we didn't ask for that privilege, right? But it's there nonetheless because we're the default. Likewise, straight privilege, you know what I mean? No one asked to be gay or straight, but the privilege is there because you grew up as the default and you weren't depicted primarily as a stereotype of a sissy or a dyke. You know what I mean? And I apologize. There's an example of a trigger word, right? Um, so if the word choices that I used throughout this video have triggered you, I apologize for that. As I said at the beginning, my aim is always to be as inclusive as I can be, filtered through the limited experience I have, and through my own white privilege, my own male privilege, um, cis male privilege. And this isn't political. These words aren't politically correct, as clumsy as they may sound. There will come a time where they're not going to sound clumsy. They sound clumsy because they're new. Bringing language into the dialogue that includes people who have been excluded is a good thing, and it's part of the evolution of language. As is the inclusion of different experiences in 200, 300, 400-year-old games that we use to tell our life experiences with. So there is my typically long-winded answer to a very good question, a very complicated question. And I hope that this sparks things and triggers good things and good dialogue for you. Yeah. And that's what I have to say about that for the moment. And I'm sure I'll have more to say in the future. But yeah. So that's that. I hope you're having a good weekend. I hope you're enjoying whatever you're doing. And I hope you're well. See you soon.